I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector News Podcast, and we're on the location for the Resourcing Tomorrow conference in London, United Kingdom. And I'm sitting across from me, my newest British contributor, Ted Butler. I came over to this side of the pod to see you, Ted.
Yeah, Mike, thanks for coming to London. It's good to see you again, and glad to talk about EVs.
Absolutely. Ted wrote a wonderful article that's appearing in our November-December issue on China's dominance in the electric vehicle market and how the West can compete with that. So let's start things off. What is China's role in the electric vehicle market?
Yeah, well, let's just start with just getting an idea of the scale of the dominance. I mean, China's a leading in terms of EV sales with 59% share. This is more than double the 25% share of Europe and nearly 6 times that 10% share of North America. In terms of EV battery production, it produces 75% of all the world's EV batteries. Of course, this is the component that accounts for 40% of the total cost of the EV itself. So a huge stronghold that China are already dominating with there.
Yeah. Now, they also control a lot of the actual metals that go into these electric vehicle batteries, do they not? Like they've cut off supply of processed graphite, for example, to the West, which is going to be a significant setback because we don't process a whole lot of graphite over on this side. How much of the components of these batteries does China control into itself?
Sure. Well, it's obviously one of the leading producers of lithium, which is key in the lithium-ion batteries. However, it also has a stronghold when it comes to rare earths as well, boasting up to 90% of the refining capacity. The US and the West is doing its best to decouple from China, as we're seeing. This is happening in the platinum group metal markets in terms of palladium. Moving away from the BRICS countries, at least, because Russia accounts for 43% of the palladium market. And what we're seeing is the West and the US are really going for platinum group metals because it's less of a direct threat to supply chain. But really, this mostly comes down to 2 companies, Chinese EV dominance. The first is BYD, China's largest EV manufacturer by units sold. They recently, in half one of 2023, registered 1.19 million EV sales. This was actually 300,000 more units than Tesla registered in that same period. And BYD aren't just EV manufacturers, they actually manufacture the battery as well. So they're the world's 3rd largest EV battery manufacturer, and they're actually on track to take 2nd place. In 2020, BYD launched and designed its own lithium battery known as the Blade battery through its subsidiary called FinDreams Battery. According to BYD, this was the first battery to have safely passed the industry standard nail penetration test. So it's really ahead of the game. And in terms of the second company, company called CATL is the world's largest EV battery manufacturer with a total share of 34%. It's a Chinese company, primarily supplies lithium-ion EV batteries to the likes of Peugeot, Hyundai, Honda, BMW, Toyota, Volkswagen, Volvo, and even Tesla. And CATL's just not finished there. It's launched a new lithium iron phosphate battery, which is fastly becoming the 3rd choice of the EV industry. It claims it can add 248 miles of range in 10 minutes of charging, which is considerably better than a lot of the options out there today. And interestingly, Elon Musk has actually already signaled his intention to use this battery cathode in the Tesla Model 3 and the Model Y. He announced this as part of his master plan document that was released earlier this year.
Yeah, so China is way ahead of us in the West in electric vehicles. Do we have a chance of catching up, or are we always going to be buying our electric vehicles and our technology from China?
Yeah, I mean, the West are trying to respond. Tesla's quickly ramping up its in-house production of something called the 4680 type cylindrical battery cells. However, it's going to take a lot of time for China to be displaced in terms of the EV battery market, especially as the Japanese EV battery manufacturer Panasonic lost 3rd place to BYD in 2022. The EU is trying its best as well. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen recently launched an anti-subsidy investigation into Chinese EVs, staunchly demanding that the EU must defend itself against China's unfair practices. Of course, this will essentially force European citizens away from buying Chinese EVs and towards buying European EVs. This is essentially throwing a toys out of the pram moment. Von der Leyen was partially responsible for European car manufacturers falling behind China. She's made a bed and now she must lie on it.
Yeah, that's always the case with government. They make decisions, and then often it's us as lying in the bed paying the price for those decisions. But if they do make this move, and China is this dominant in the battery manufacturing already, how do we get the actual batteries that we're going to need for the EVs that we're going to manufacture in the West if China is the only ones manufacturing the batteries?
Sure, I mean, a lot of it would come down to substitution. Perhaps, I've recently been speaking to deep sea mining companies at the conference today, and there's a huge wealth of nickel in the Clarion-Clipperton zone in the Pacific Ocean. If that can be tapped into on behalf of the West, then certainly, that could take precedent as the new battery metal, with nickel being a key component. Aside from that, we've just got to really understand why this happened. I mean, the US fell asleep at the wheel when it came to its own domestic manufacturing, and the EU for that part. Going back to the turn of the century, the US was one of the top manufacturers in the world, and it just really let go of its stronghold and benefited from China's cheap labor costs, and now it's bearing the brunt of the consequences.
Yeah, no doubt. I've often wondered, though, with the Chinese dominance and the world moving to a bifurcated economy, I've often wondered if the green tech and electric vehicle revolution in the West either would end up getting stalled due to lack of materials to actually get the cars on the road, or was it going to evolve in a completely different direction, and what the other side, or the BRICS Chinese side of the equation, was going to evolve? Have you seen any indication as to the effects as we try to break the Chinese stronghold on the EV market to get more Western influence within our sphere of things? Are you seeing that? Is it going to stall the process, or is it going to have it evolve in that different direction?
Sure, yeah. I mean, obviously, we all know that 80% of global energy usage comes down to hydrocarbons. So, sadly, straddling across is going to be a much more difficult task than we originally thought. And I think a lot of it's going to involve hybrid vehicles before EVs. There are certainly some interesting applications in hydrogen, in terms of, I think BMW's i5 was renowned for charging quicker than a lot of the electric vehicles. So there are potential avenues that the West could explore. But I think in terms of how it responds, the best way for it to respond would be targeting different industries in which it already has an existing dominance. For example, semiconductor design. The US has 85% share of the semiconductor design industry, and it would really be about leveraging that in terms of sanctions to yield pain to the likes of China and Russia, as opposed to tackling China on a ground where it's already got first mover advantage and has already established a significant lead ahead.
Yeah, however, isn't that setting it up for a tit for tat type of battle? We cut off their semiconductors, they take away the graphite and lithium processing, and nobody gets ahead.
Absolutely. I mean, in an ideal world, there would be free trade, and there would be no tariffs or import taxes, and there would be amicable relationships with the countries on the West and the East. But unfortunately, that's not the case, and that's for a number of reasons. I mean, we're currently living in a highly conflicted world with wars happening in Israel and Palestine. China are kind of leaning towards the Palestine side. Obviously, the US and the West are considerably in support of Israel, with Biden just sleepily making his way over there a couple of weeks ago. And obviously as well, last time we were in Vegas, we spoke about the African resource wars. That's another battleground in which the division between the BRICS and the West is there for all to see. So in response to your question, no, I don't really see China's dominance in the EV market changing because the relationships between the West and East are soured, to say the least.
Okay, so you're leaning in the camp that our electric vehicle revolution may take a different form than what the Chinese revolution may look like.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. There is a possibility that the Western EV manufacturers can find new innovations that can sort of skyrocket their demand. I'm not sure how likely this is, because what you have to understand with a lot of the European and Western car manufacturers is that they're all legacy car manufacturers, bar Tesla. So it's almost they're forced to kind of eat their own market share of internal combustion engine cars by pursuing the EV revolution, whereas firms like BYD, they're more agile. They're not contradicting themselves by pursuing the EV revolution. So there's less standing in the way for China, which I think is one of the reasons why it's been able to establish such a dominant position.
Yeah, also being authoritarian, I guess they can dictate more to their citizenry as to you must drive this type of a vehicle too. Like Western countries are looking to make these similar kind of dictates that you must have an electric vehicle by 2030, or you're going to start to pay higher taxes on your insurance, higher taxes on driving your car, tolls in certain areas. I heard from a taxi driver while I was here in London that if you have a diesel car by 2028, I think he said, you'll pay a substantial toll to drive your car around London.
I mean, yeah, we're already seeing that with the ULEZ zones, which are these horribly traffic congestion inducing mechanisms that they're just impractical. They make it very difficult for everyday people and the average Joes to just get around. And a lot of these people rely on a car for their commute to work. So it's a real obstruction. And then, you know, we have the likes of Just Stop Oil protesting in the UK here. But what we're seeing is the UK government is going back on its overly ambitious pledges. I mean, I think it pledged that by 2030 EVs will be phased out. ICE vehicles will be phased out. I think it's now pushed that back to 2035 in line with the EU's targets. So I think a necessary dose of reality is needed to bring the Western governments back in line with how feasible this transition really is. And we are going to have to be dependent on internal combustion engines for a lot longer until we have the metals mined from the green revolution that can then form the electric vehicle requirements.
Yeah, that actually answered the question I was kind of heading down towards, was, do the Western governments have to back down on their commitments to electrification and the timelines that they're looking for? And in your opinion, that it's clearly that is the case. The other question that I had for this is that when I look at the BRICS nations and how, you know, on the resource side of everything, the African nations seem to be different than the South American nations that are joining BRICS. In that in Africa, they're happy to mine the commodities and instead of selling them to the West, selling them to China. Whereas I refer to it trading one colonizer for another.
Sure.
But in South America, that's not the case. They want to mine the goods and then turn it into viable, usable product in their own countries. And you're seeing the likes of Stellantis, who's, you know, the largest auto manufacturer in the world, buy into large mining projects in places like Brazil, places like Argentina, places like Peru, with the plan of setting up shop there and actually building the batteries and the vehicles in those marketplaces. So I'm wondering if part of the West response to this is a return to what was called the Monroe Doctrine, which ended during Nixon's time, where things that happen in our hemisphere or our business stay out of it. And I'm wondering if that's what we're going to see. And then as we reshore manufacturing from the East, are we going to see it rather than reshore back to Europe, back to the United States, and even Canada, see that reshore to some of these so-called BRICS nations in South America, where this policy seems to be taking hold? Is that the future for the electric vehicles in the West?
I think so. Yeah, I think a lot of reshoring will be necessary. You touched on it earlier. I think the involvement of the car manufacturers in the contribution of capital expenditure to the mining companies will be key to facilitating that. Obviously, the mining industry's been struggled from an unprecedented shortage of capex in the last decade, to say the least. And if the West is to stand a chance of achieving this green revolution, it's going to need the mining companies and the automotive sector to collaborate in order to, apply a concerted effort towards achieving this green utopia that's often, as it's often referred to.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other side of this equation that, we always talk about the electric vehicles, but there's also the infrastructure that needs to power those electric vehicles. How far ahead is China in powering their electric vehicle fleet versus us in the West?
Sure. Well, 50% of China's EV sales are domestic. So assuming that the infrastructure is there and it's in a way that's more considerable than the West. I don't think, personally, if I were to buy a car now, I don't think I would buy an EV. My dad recently had the pleasure of using a Tesla as a substitution for his old car, and he found it to be very inconvenient driving down to London. Had to stop multiple times. So certainly in the UK, the infrastructure doesn't exist. I don't know for the US. I would assume that the EU is better than the US, with the fact that they have 25% share of the EV sales market, and the US has US and Canada have a 10% share combined. So I would assume that the US is probably very far behind on the infrastructure front, but I don't have the exact figures to back that up. I would just assume it from the EV sales.
Yeah, I see horror pictures, and realistically, they also occur on long weekends. But there's a small town in British Columbia called Hope. It's was famous. That's where the Rambo movies were
Right.
filmed back
Okay.
in the early 1980s. But it's a jumping off point from the Lower Mainland or Vancouver to the cities and the communities in the interior. And there's always these pictures of these 3-4 hour lineups of Teslas waiting to get charged in hope so that they can get to their next destination, be it Kelowna in the interior, or Prince George up north. And I just look at that, and I agree with your father. I'm going like, well, I don't want to have to wait 3 hours just to get my car charged so I can go forward. So yeah, we do have a long way to go.
And the UK government is increasingly realizing this as well. I think it recently just opened the North Sea oil and gas drilling after however many years of that being out of use. So it knows that it's going to have to increase its reliance, go back on its promises, go back to oil and gas, at least whilst we straddle across to these EV solutions, which will take time to come into use.
And how's that going to affect, environmentalists such as the Stop Oil people?
Well, it's certainly going to be a bit of a bee in their bonnet, as we say in the UK, but they're going to have to get used to it, because the alternative is that we rush towards renewables and they're not there. And if the supply is short and the demand is high, the price will rise, and that will make electric vehicles incredibly costly. And that will be passed on to the consumer, who already, with interest rates as they are, which are affecting the cost of the mortgages and the cost of their business, cost of borrowing in terms of their business, they're already suffering as much as it is. So that's the last thing we would need, would be an unreasonable move towards electric vehicles.
So if to sum all this up, in order for the West to compete and start to, catch up to China, we're going to need to have a lot of planning and policy by government. God help us, that never goes well, but that's going to have to be what the solution is. And
Sure.
in all of this, we have to start to look forward with realistic eyes, as opposed to, well, we'll call them green glasses as opposed to pink glasses, as to what we can actually accomplish.
I would agree with that. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Mike.
Not a problem. For those who want to read Ted's article, I'll put a link to the bottom of the description of this podcast, and you can click right through to the directly to the magazine. And please subscribe to the Prospector News while you're there, and we can send that directly to your inbox in the future. Pleasure seeing you, Ted, and I understand we might see each other in Vancouver in January. It'd be nice to show you around my former hometown.
We certainly will. Look forward to it.
The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.